Ganesha. On behalf of my family, I would like to welcome you to Victoria's second annual dialogue with Paramacharya Sadasivanathaswami from Kauai's Hindu Monastery. We can collectively thank Lord Ganesha for bringing us here all together for this wonderful spiritual occasion, that is this dialogue. I hope everyone will be able to take away something special from this talk. However, before we start, I would like to ask Lord Ganesha to remove all the obstacles in the way of this event so we will be able to run through our program without any difficulties. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope that you enjoy this event. At this moment, I'd like to invite Paramacharya Sadasivanathaswami to begin his dialogue. Thank you.
So it seems that hundreds of years ago, there was a king in South India, and he was a very beloved king, fair, just, and kindly, and loved all of those in his realm, and they loved him because, you know, you want a king of that kind. If you're going to have a leader, that's the kind of leader that you want. And he was happy, and they were happy, and everything was going along nicely in the kingdom until one day he had a horrible dream, a really bad dream. One of those dreams, you know, that are so real. Have you woken up and you think, oh my God, that is just as real as this world. The dream as real as that. And in this dream, he was an impoverished mendicant and not a king at all. And this shattered his self-image so much that he started doubting every day after that dream, who am I? Am I the king and the wealthy leader of these people, or am I really deep inside something else, something very, very different? And he was really struggling, and we want to hear what his sorrow sounded like. You can see how miserable this king was. That was great. And he kept struggling with this identity crisis. Am I the king? Am I just an impoverished person? And if I am inside, deep in my soul, this other person, I really shouldn't be leading all of these good souls in my kingdom. I should maybe step aside, or I can't step aside. On and on he went, struggling with this dilemma. And so then he decided, you know, I need help. And he called in his ministers and sat them down and told them about the dream and about his doubts. And he said, what can we do? What can I do about this? And ministers just shrugged their shoulders. I don't know what you can do. You're the king. We can't really help you. So then he called in some philosophers, and they couldn't help. And he called in some scientists of the age, and they couldn't help. And he was just trying so hard to get some help. And then one day, Hope kind of walked into his chambers in the form of a guru, a spiritual master. And he asked the spiritual master, like he was asking everybody for weeks and weeks, this happened to me, and Swamiji, what can I do? Can you help me? And the sage said, of course I can help you. And so we have the hope of the king to listen to. So the king said, what's the first step? And the sage said, well, the first step is that you have to become my disciple. And you have to take a vow that you'll make me your guru. And the king said, I'm so desperate, I'll do anything. That's what it takes, I'm your man. And so he took this vrata, this vow, to the king. And then the king said, okay, so now you're my disciple. And you know the first rule of discipleship, right? That's to obey your guru, number one. So you have to obey everything I tell you to do from now on. And the king said, if that'll solve my problem, I'm good with that. So the king said, call in all of your scribes and bring some, probably in those days it was parchment, or maybe it was even olive leaves that they would scratch. And he said, I want you to bequeath everything in the kingdom to me. I want you to make me the king. And so we're going to write down every piece of real estate, every cow and elephant, every castle in the kingdom. You're going to hand it over to me legally, and we're going to sign this together, and they'll have all these witnesses. So they went through that process. So after that was done, the king said, what's next? He said, well, the next thing is I have a gift for you. So I want to give you the nicest castle on the northwest side of the region, and I'm going to give you 1,000 horses and 50 elephants and 600 sheep and goats and hundreds of acres of fruit trees and coconut trees. And so we're sign all those papers too. So all this real estate business is going on. And so then the king said, we did all of that, and the king turned to the sage and said, well, what's next? He said, well, we're done. He said, what do you mean? We're finished. Well, the king was flummoxed. He didn't know what the sage was doing. Well, all we had done is had this exchange of real estate as far as he could see. And then the sage explained. He said, well, think about it. You're an intelligent man. Think about it for a minute. Are you a king? And then the fellow had to say, well, no, you're the king. I said, okay. Well, are you a pauper? Well, no, I'm not a pauper. I mean, I own the best castle on the northern side and all of these other things. And so the sage says, see, you're not a king, which was one of your identities, and you're not a pauper, which was the identity that you feared. You're the eternal, immortal, undying consciousness and soul that all of us are. And that's what you were all along, but I had to show you how that works. And so then this erstwhile king went into an enlightened state of mind, which, what does that sound like? Shashank?
No pressure.
So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the king's state of mind, of what it's like to die when you're enlightened. And we don't think about that very often, probably. But I thought it'd be a very fascinating topic to explore when the Pillai family put me on this stage. And so I've been thinking about it, and then I've developed 10 little stories. These are true stories of sages and saints, gurus who have let go of their body, as I like to call it. Because in Hinduism, we don't really have a word for death. That it's a pretty dark word in the English language, you know, death, dying. But in the Indic languages, it's a much sweeter and really a more accurate tale. We talk about the great departure, or the great journey, Mahaprasthana. And we don't look at, I mean, death is so final and bleak and hopeless, and there's not much on the other side of it. Whereas in the Indian consciousness, there's so much on the other side of death that, you know, it's not a problem that we're leaving something behind, because there's an amazing experience that awaits. And so I don't use the word death. I don't like the word death. But I did put it in my title. So we're going to explore 10 stories, and also I put together 10 reasons that we should not fear death. We're going to build up a little inventory of intellectual reasons and spiritual reasons that we should not be afraid of our own death, or of the death of anyone, even the people that we love. You know, well, you know all about that. Does anyone here ever hear what the last words of Stephen Jobs were? Mm-hmm. You know. Stephen Jobs, of course, is the Apple founder, and I think he passed away in 2011, not that long ago. And his sister, he had kind of an estranged sister, I think her name was Mona, who came back, and they got together toward the end of life. And he had an advanced form of pancreatic cancer. And he was young, 56 is young, and yet it was his time. And so the sister was at his side when he left his body. And she reported back to us being the outside world, because she was the only one who was there, what Stephen Jobs said in his last moments. So I'm going to repeat to you he said 6 words. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. And then he left his body. Isn't that an interesting final statement about something that he saw and somewhere he was going? And it doesn't sound like it was something to be afraid of at all. At all. I always found that charming. So the first reason not to fear death that I'm proposing for your consideration is that it doesn't exist. It's really a myth. It's like a unicorn. You know, you can't be afraid of a unicorn because unicorns are just legends. And they're not real. Oh, they are? Okay, unicorns. I've never seen one, but it doesn't mean I don't believe that you're right. But I think of it like the sun rising. You know, people say, "Oh, look, the sun's coming up in the east." It's morning time, like on the picture we saw. But the sun doesn't come up. Sun doesn't go down. The earth tumbles through space and reveals the sun, tumbles through space some more and conceals the sun. The rising and setting of the sun is an unreal thing that we all live with from day to day. And then, someone says, well, is the sun coming up? We all know what that means, but the truth is, it's a myth. The sun doesn't come up. And I think that we need to look at death in the same way. By death, I mean the kind of Western definition that we've been taught about death. Not something larger that we're talking about tonight, but this idea that, you die. And this end, this termination, this diminishment, this disappearance of our existence into what? That we don't know. We don't know where people go. Some people are afraid they're going to go to a very dark place for a very long time, and some people are going to go to a world of light for a very long time. But we don't know, and I think we should look at the Western form of death as a myth, and nobody's really afraid of a unicorn. Are we? No. So the first story of a sage who died is Ramana Maharishi. Most of you may know Ramana Maharishi, a great sage from South India. So Ramana Maharishi fell ill in 1947. He wasn't that old, he was 68, and he had a cancer. One of the Swamis in South India once told me a few years ago that he felt that an inordinate percentage of great gurus died of cancer, and that his theory was it was because he was taking on all the karmas of his disciples and of the others around them, and that acceptance of and resolution of their karmas manifest in the form of a cancer. I don't know if that's true. So the doctors came. This was a cancer that was on his arm. It's quite a large tumor, actually. And the doctors tried a few things, Ayurveda and so forth, to no effect, basically. And then the doctors came to him and said, in order to save your life, we would like to amputate your arm. And Ramana Maharishi said, no, we're not going to do that. And he said, basically, why mutilate this body? Someday it's going to go, and, this is the day. And I don't want to start chopping up my body just because the day has arrived. And so he did an interesting thing. In Indian culture, it's regarded as extremely auspicious and powerful to be with the guru when he leaves his body. It's regarded as a time of elevated awareness and power and inner power. And it's as though you're there at this magical moment. And if you can touch that energy, it's a blessing to anyone who experiences that. So his disciples wanted to be close to him, and in a very unusual gesture to them, he had his little cot, which is a simple Indian cot, brought into a courtyard in the ashram in South India. And he lived on that cot with hundreds of people around him as his body weakened and weakened and weakened and ultimately failed. And this was his gift to them. This gift of, okay, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to allow you all to be at every stage of this. Normally, when we get to that point, there's a vanity and an ego that comes to play where, your body isn't looking so pretty, and you're not feeling very good, and all of that care, we tend to hush and hide. We push it behind a curtain. It happens. We know it's happening, but we're not there to see it happen. But he had this remarkable egolessness that allowed him to sit on a cot and slowly, slowly let go of his body for everyone to be there. I think that's just such a gift and such an amazing, amazing story somehow. I had someone who was dying that I was close to, and she turned to me at one point and said, "I think vanity is the last thing to go." So what they did, I just see my story, I forgot that. So he left his body on April 14th, 1950, and they all sat and sang a beautiful Siva hymn as that happened. And just before he passed away, a big tear went down his cheek, and that was kind of his goodbye to them. And following Indian tradition, when a awakened soul, an enlightened soul dies, it's considered that that body, that the physicality, even the molecules and bones and of that body, have been imbued with his light-filled consciousness, his divine revelations. And so, whereas most bodies in India are cremated, bodies of sages are not always cremated. So he followed that tradition. He asked his disciples, and what they did is that they dug a pit in the ground, and they put the body, the guru's body, in the lotus posture, and they sit him at the bottom of this pit, and they fill the whole pit with salt, which kind of preserves the body. And then they seal over the pit, and that becomes what's called the samadhi of the guru. And what they did in the case of Ramana Maharishi is they put a Siva lingam on top of that crypt, which is a sacred murti, worshipful murti of Shiva, and they built a temple on top of that. So anyone who wants to touch his energy, his life, his consciousness goes to this Shiva temple, and he's regarded as sort of being present in that space. You can visit that temple in India if you want. It's in South India. Tiruvannamalai, yes. So the second reason to not fear death in tonight's exploration of that subject is that we have reincarnation. More and more people in the Western world are believing in reincarnation, by the way. When I talked last year about this, we were talking about SPNR. Some of you remember. Who was at our talk last year? Okay, so last year we talked about spiritual but not religious, and how these millennials are adopting a lot of Indian thought. For example, the all-pervasiveness of God, that idea, the reincarnation and karma. Those are ideas that came out of India. But now, today, I'm told by Pew pollsters that 26% of Americans believe in reincarnation. It's a pretty good-sized number. And reincarnation, of course, has been in India and South Asia forever and ever and ever. And there's been a lot in our scriptures about reincarnation. And the whole idea that you take one body and then another and another. My Guru David had a quote, I'm going to read it to you. Man takes one body and then another. in his progression through the cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. So those who understand these things would tell you, you've had many births. And the older a soul you are, the more births you've had. You know, there are people who are mean and selfish and base and instinctual. They're just perfectly good souls. They're just young souls, kind of stupid. And then you find souls right next to them that are very loving and harmonious and gentle and understanding. And those, how did they get there? They went through a lot of stupid births and learned a lot of important things that life had to offer them. So reincarnation is if you ever want to get rid of the fear of death, you just start believing in reincarnation, and it won't look so ominous. You know, in reincarnation, we go through all kinds of these identity issues. Like our king, we didn't know if he was a king or a pauper, but you know, we in this life, you think, okay, I'm a mother, I'm a father, I'm a girl, I'm a boy, I'm educated, I'm foolish. You go through all these identities, and they're temporary identities that we have, because deep inside of those identities is the real us, that spirit, or that consciousness that is a thread between births. And that just leaves this body, goes to the next body, learns some more, leaves that body, goes to the next body. And so what's so scary about that? A lot of children can remember past births, by the way, until we tell them that they're not supposed to talk about those things. But little kids will often make reference to their past births, but then we teach them that those memories are not real, they're unicorns. Wait a minute, unicorns are real. So the next story is the Buddha. You all know the Buddha. He's a very famous fellow. And when his own death was approaching, I think he had, I'm taking this from a long, long time ago, but I think he had 5,000 monks when he passed away. And so they all gathered for his transition. And he wrote something for all of them. He said, of all the footprints, that of the elephant is the supreme footprint. And of all the meditations, that which understands death is supreme. And he was said to have passed away under the same banyan tree in Bodh Gaya, India, as he was theoretically born under and enlightened under. That's the story it is supposed to be. So he was giving a sermon as he was leaving, and this is what was written down by his disciples. This is the Buddha talking. It is not appropriate for you to grieve in this hour of joy. You all weep, but what is the cause of your weeping? Your salvation does not depend on me, but upon the practice of yoga and dharma. Just as a cure depends not upon seeing a doctor, but upon taking his medicine. My time has come and my work is done. And everything, as you know, eventually comes to an end. I've trained all whom I could train, and my teachings will last for many generations. So do not be disturbed. Recognize that all lives are subject to the laws of impermanence. When the light of knowledge dispels ignorance, and when the world is seen to have no substance, the end of life is seen as peace and as a cure for disease. And with these words, the Buddha entered into a wonderful, quiet, silent meditation and left his body. And then all of those around him said that the whole earth shook like a ship in a storm as he left his body. So the third reason to not fear death is that releasing the body is the natural way of things. You all know that everything that takes form eventually dissolves. So mountains rise and then they slowly erode. Actually, they rise quickly and slowly erode. And then galaxies gather slowly and then they quickly explode. And everything, including our body, is not permanent. And in the case of, some describe the return of the life force like a river going back into the ocean. The river comes out of the ocean. Before it was a river, it was oceanness. And then the rain went to the mountains and created a river. And then it became something called the Colorado River. And then it goes back into the ocean and stops being a river. So the riverness is a temporary state of things. The real permanent state is oceanness, and that's kind of what's happening when we leave this encasement and we go into a higher, bigger place. We're returning to our bigger divine self. People who are around the dying all the time, they're kind of the hospice angels of the universe, the most amazing people. I know a few of them who've been at the side of like 300 or 500 people when they died. And they tell me that what happens just right toward the end is that everyone comes to this place of beauty, this place of acceptance, this place of non-resistance to what's going on. And also a great lucidity comes, even if they've been kind of comatose or something like that for months or even years. As they come to the moment of releasing their body, a tremendous clarity and love comes pouring out. And that should show us another thing to not be afraid of. And even people who have died, you may know some of this, the near-death experiences, which are not near-death experiences, they're real death experiences. They're just not permanent death experiences. But these are people who are clinically dead. Their brains are dead. And there's no reason in the world that they should have awareness still, and yet they do. And you've heard stories of that. So they've left their body. The body is gone, dead. The brain is dead. And yet they're totally aware in the hospital. And they can tell you later just what the one doctor said to another doctor while, pronouncing him as a goner. So, very interesting. So here comes the third story of a Zen master. Tushan was his name. He was the founder of the Soto school of Buddhism, if you're familiar with that. And so the time had come for him to leave the world, and he got all the monks together, and he rang a little bell, and as soon as he left his body, all of the monks started weeping inconsolably. They just couldn't stop it, because he was the guru, and you love your guru like your mother and your father and everybody put together. And so they started crying and crying, and so powerfully that he came right back into his body, brought him right back. And he said to them, what's this? What's all this grief? You know, basically, haven't I taught you better than this? And he explained to them very carefully that monks are supposed to be detached. Monks are supposed to know the transitoriness of life. And here, you know, you got miserable. And so he ordered what he called a stupidity-removing lunch for everyone. So they went to the kitchen and they made a lunch that was, I guess, in his mind, to remove the stupidity that they had just expressed upon his demise. And they all had lunch together and a final chat. And then he told them that he was going. And then he also told them, he said, this time I want to just let you know that when someone's ready to leave their body, they don't need a lot of commotion. So let's not do that again. And then he went into meditation and left his body. So the fourth reason to not fear death is that it's really an exalted state. I think Stephen Jobs' wow, wow, wow is kind of a simple way of looking at that. But it's something, in Indian thought, death properly done and properly prepared for is called moksha, which means liberation. So you're liberated. This is an elevated time, a time of extremely high consciousness that is to be respected. And it can be this release from karmas and release from embodiment. Neem Karoli Baba, who was a 20th century guru, told his disciples when he was passing away that they shouldn't be sad. Disciples are always sad in these stories, which is natural. I know I was. But Neem Karoli Baba said, you have to think of it as I'm being liberated, I'm going into this moksha, I'm going to a higher place, and think of it as a release from jail. So he told his disciples, think of it, I'm being released from central prison today. So the fourth story is a very short one. J. Krishnamurti was a young, brilliant, spiritual teenager who the Theosophical Society decided was going to be nurtured to become the next Messiah. They had him set up to be the second coming. And they trained him for years to do that. And then one day when he was in California, I think he was in his early 20s, he had these profound superconscious experiences which totally obliterated the idea that he would pretend to be the savior of the world. And the rest of his life he spent fighting that idea that there is a savior of the world and telling people that was so much nonsense. But when he was 90 years old, he was getting ready to release his body, and he just very quietly turned to his attendant and said, I'll be going now. I have to walk in the forest. And he died. And walked in his astral forest, I guess. Must have been a beautiful forest. So the fifth reason not to fear death that I propose is that death is a relief often from suffering. You know, the body diminishes and weakens and organs fail and different parts don't work anymore as like they used to work when we started. And we've all seen, I think, times when leaving the body was a great gift to someone, a gift of freedom from pain and suffering. And not that it's always like that, but when it is, it really is a beautiful thing and something to really look forward to instead of to be afraid of. I kind of like, people who try to hang on to the body too much. My guru thought that wasn't a good thing, to be so attached that you basically go through all these heroic measures to have one more day. No matter how miserable that day is, you get one more miserable day. And Gurudeva thought that wasn't wise to approach it that way. And Abraham Lincoln said a cute thing, which I've always liked. He said, it's not the days in your life that matter. It's the life in your days. That's Abraham Lincoln. So our fifth story is about a Chinese master. His name was Chin Sing, and he passed away long ago in the year 905. And so he turned to his monks and he said, who dies sitting up like this? And the monk said, a monk does. That's how monks die. I should probably jump forward and tell you, Buddhism looks at this, it probably explored death and conscious death more than anybody else. And they regard a conscious death as kind of a signature of attainment. It's sort of proof that this person, in fact, did enlighten himself during life because he could consciously leave the body. So they work very hard to consciously leave the body. So that's why in this story, it's important. So he says, well, who dies sitting up? And sitting up means sitting in lotus, like in a meditative pose with your spine straight, and then you work to release the body. And so the monk said, monk does. He says, well, who dies standing up? And then the monks responded to him and said, oh, enlightened monks die standing up. And then he said, there's one more part to the story. So then he said, who dies walking? Have you ever heard of that? And the monk said, no, I've never heard of that. And so he took 7 steps in the garden, standing up, and died. He was showing that he was really enlightened. So the 6th reason to not fear death is that we kind of have a micro-death every day when we go to sleep. So some yogis feel actually that you do something very similar to death when you close your eyes and go to sleep at night, and you wake up from that. And this idea that death is just like leaving a room, my guru described it, he says it's just like leaving this room and walking into that room. I mean, that's how simple it is. It's not a complicated thing. And in the old Tamil scriptures, Tirukkural, there's this beautiful couplet that says, death is like going to sleep, and birth is like waking up from that sleep. So 2,000 years ago, they were thinking these same thoughts. How are we doing with our time? I think it's 10 to 8. I think I need to skip some things here. So I'm going to skip a long story. But I think I'm going to go home and put all of this on YouTube. So you don't know this, but I spent a couple of months preparing a really glorious slideshow for you tonight. And just before I left, I realized the error of my ways, that I was going to have you looking at a screen instead of me talking with you, and I threw the whole thing away. So the seventh reason not to fear death is that everybody's doing it. It's just so popular. I don't know if you know, but every day on Earth, about 160,000 of us leave our body. That's 6,500 every hour, or 108 every minute. So every day, 160,000, 160,000, 160,000. It's interesting numbers that come up. So this is a story of a Master Pu Hua. He's a Chinese monk. He was very eccentric. He was a wanderer. But just because you're wandering doesn't mean you're lost. And he was getting near his death, and he announced to everyone that in the town that he was going to leave his body. And he said, I'm going to go tomorrow to the North Gate. This is a Chinese city, and it had these 4 gates on the cardinal points. So I'm going to go tomorrow to the North Gate, and you can all come, and I'm going to leave my body. So the whole village or town or whatever it was came, because this, you don't have TV. And so they went to the North Gate to be with him at his transition. He got there and he looked around and he said, this doesn't feel right. I think what I'll do is we'll come back here tomorrow on the South Gate, and we'll do it then. So he went back, and the next day he came to the South Gate, and everyone came to the South Gate to watch him leave his body. And he got there and he said, I just have this kind of intuition from, there's a bird in their tradition that's, what's it called? The blue crow. So there's a bird in the Chinese tradition called a blue crow. This is not an ordinary bird, this is a big bird. This bird could lift elephants, according to the stories. So he said, the blue crow kind of told me that not to do it today at the South Gate. So what we'll do is we'll go to the East Gate tomorrow afternoon and get this thing done. So I went to the East Gate the next day, and he looked around. The crowd was kind of a little bit diminished, there were well, not quite so many of them showed up for the event. And so I went to the East Gate, and he said, I don't know, it's not working for me, and I think tomorrow at the West Gate is what we need to do. So the next day, he had one of his monks build a coffin, and he carried the coffin to the West Gate, and there were only a trickle of people at this point, because he wasn't really fulfilling his promises, and he climbed in the coffin and perished right there. And that was how he went and left his body. So my own theory is that he didn't want the kind of curiosity seekers there, right? So it was kind of a way of winnowing out those who weren't that serious about it and just having with him the real dedicated ones. So the eighth reason not to fear death, to me, comes from nature. In our monastery, when a cow comes to the point of, she's maybe 14, 15 years old, and she gave us milk for 12 of those years, and then we put her in the pasture to count rainbows and eat grass for a few years. And when she's ready to go, what does she do? She goes over under a tree and lays down on the grass and doesn't get up. So basically she stops eating and stops drinking water, and within a few days she's gone. And our cats are the same way, except that they like to go underneath buildings and hide. So they'll get ready to, when they know they're going to die, they'll get away from you and go in some quiet place, and we have to go find them, you know, when that happens. But that's how nature does it. And I discovered an amazing thing as my own guru was going through this process, that fasting diminishes pain and suffering in the body. That if you stop eating and you stop drinking, something happens deep in the body that basically masks all suffering and pain. It just goes away. It's a natural, what do we call the analgesic, a natural analgesic. And the Jains, I don't know if you know, but the Jain religion has this fasting as a spiritual discipline. And they didn't, they've done it for thousands of years. And more recently, I don't know how many years ago it was, but maybe 15 years ago, the Indian government outlawed it. And they outlawed it because they said, well, that's suicide. If you stop eating, that's suicide. And then almost right away, the Supreme Court came after that law and threw that law out and said that's not suicide at all. That's how nature does it, and why can't a human being make a choice to stop eating if he wants to? And that was what happened with my guru. And he found out one day he was marching through Europe with all of us and doing amazing things at the age of 74. And he came back to the island, and the next day he found out that he had metastasized cancer in his brain and in his organs and in his gut. And then 3 teams of doctors confirmed that, and that when he found out, basically his time had come, and there was one doctor who wanted to fight the good fight. We can do this, and then we can do that, and then it'll only, and Gurudeva said, no, that's not how I want to go. I want to go in a yogic fashion. And so he decided to do this. It's called prayopavesha in Sanskrit language, fasting to death. And it's not unknown in the Western world. I think it's called, Mors voluntaria religiosa, I think, in Latin. Mors voluntara religiosa is a Latin term. And so it's known in all cultures, but it's not followed very much. And I thought my guru's modeling of this was marvelous, because why? Because it shows us another way to do it. It's nice to have options. And he showed a way to do it where you don't just fight and get weaker and weaker and spend more and more to die in a coma. He wanted to die sitting up, and he did. So this is a story of a Tibetan yogi. In Tibet, they study the winds of the body a lot, the pranas, and they do a lot of breathing things. And one of the beliefs in the Tibetan scheme of things, cosmology, is that we're all born with a certain number of breaths, and that you perish when you've used up all of those breaths, however many they may be. So when this Tibetan yogi found out that it was his time, he asked his assistant monk, he said, what's an auspicious day coming up where I can I can leave my body on an auspicious day. And the monk looked at the Panchangam, the sacred calendar. He said, well, you know, it's 3 days away. It would be a pretty good day. And the yogi said, I don't know if I can make it 3 days. And the young monk went into the meditation hall a little later, and the yogi was sitting there totally upright but not breathing at all. And so they went and they determined he was not breathing. But they thought maybe there was a pulse in the body. And so they left him alone. And then they came back the next morning, and he had this big exhalation. And then he had a little talk with them, and had lunch with them. And then he took this big breath and went back into this state, not breathing, and the heartbeat hardly beating. And then the next day they came, and then he asked the attendant, is this the day? And the attendant said, yes, this is the auspicious moment, and he died. So the story in the Tibetan world is that he was saving, he knew that if he kept breathing, that he wouldn't make it to the auspicious moment, so he stopped breathing and controlled his breath so profoundly that he could do that. That's a hard thing to do. So I want to take one story from Western sage Socrates. Do you know about Socrates passing? It's kind of interesting. I'll tell the short version. So Socrates had been accused of creating new gods in Athens, and been accused of teaching his disciples wrong things, and not the kind of the dogma of the moment. And so they put him in a court and they pronounced him guilty, and then he had a choice that he could either stop teaching and leave the kingdom forever, or he could die by his own hand drinking a bowl of hemlock poison. So Socrates couldn't imagine life without teaching the divine teachings, and so he said, okay, well, we'll do the hemlock thing. So that his disciples, including Plato and everyone, gathered around him, and the executioner came in and mixed this bowl of poison just to the right specifications. And in fact, there was a dialogue between Socrates and the executioner, and Socrates asked the executioner, what should I expect? And the executioner said, well, what's going to happen is you're going to lose feeling first in your extremities of your limbs, and then you're going to lose the feeling more centrally, and then you're going to collapse, and then you're going to die. And so Socrates drinks this bowl of poison and keeps teaching everyone, of course, the rebel that he was, as he goes through this process. And just before he released himself from his body, he turned to one of his students and he said, please pay the farmer for the chicken that I owe him money for. And then he died. So the reason that that's kind of cool in my mind is that it touches on the idea of resolving things before you die. The importance of, he didn't want that little debt, that little karmic thorn to go on into his next life. And so he said, give 12 drachmas to the farmer, because I owe him that. And those are his last words of this great mind. His last words were, pay for the chicken. And it reminded me of a story that came when my guru was on his fasting bed. He was on his fasting bed for 32 days. And people were starting to say goodbye to him. The people who loved him from all over the world, and they would email me, and then I would go to his side and read their sweet goodbyes to him, and it was quite moving for me, very profound. And then we got this one email one day, and the email said something like this. It said, Gurudeva, you won't remember me. I only knew you for 2 minutes. But those 2 minutes changed my life. So let me tell you what happened. It said you were in Los Angeles and you were giving a talk in a big hotel somewhere. And as you came out of the hall and headed toward your car, I rushed up to you and I told you that my father was dying. And as soon as I said those words to you, you said, "That's wonderful." I couldn't believe you said that at first. It was such a shocking response to my sharing that with you. But it just shattered completely everything I was thinking and feeling about my father's death. And then you said, walk with me to my car. So in the minute and a half it took us to walk to your car, you said, you know, this is such a blessing. Some people get hit by a bus and they don't have a chance to deal with anything in life. Now you and your father can go through the process very consciously and softly, and you can guide him, and that'll be your job now. Not to be sad, not to cry in front of him. What he needs is for you to be at his side and take him through this little pilgrimage that he's on. Then you jumped in your car and you went away. He said, from that moment, the whole death experience changed for me. And I went back to my father's side, and we started the process and went through. I think Gurudeva had told her that Dad should ask for forgiveness and give forgiveness and things like that before he passed away, and that would be the fulfillment of this life and the preparation for the next life. I might have cried a little when I read that to him. It's possible. I did prepare 4, I call them takeaways. And on the plane over here, I made a little slideshow. Is the slideshow there, Yogi? So the first takeaway that I have, and I'll just start talking and the thing can come on, is that the spiritual people always suggest that death be natural, a natural death. Hopefully without mind-numbing drugs or lots of machinery and strangers around. They urge us to do it in our home and with those that love us and support us, and not just be in the ICU when we depart. And those who leave the earth plane often remain aware of those who remain. And so Gurudeva described how the emotional traumas of those who are still living can adversely affect the departed soul, who is naturally saddened to see loved ones suffering. And so knowing this, he suggested that we mourn, but not overmuch. So the moment of death is a takeaway. It's very crucial, as some of our stories tell. And where we are in consciousness at that final moment sets the direction of our journey. If we are living in fear, that's living in the lower consciousness. We're living in the chakras, below the Muladhara sometimes. Then we will end up on the astral plane. That's the rule. If you're living in fear, you're living in anger, you're living in jealousy in those lower chakras, when you leave the body, through those lower chakras, you'll end up in a lower world, because that's where you are when you were in this life. And that's why these yogis we talked about are trying to leave through the Ajna chakra or through the top chakra. That's the ideal. And the fourth takeaway is there. We're often more concerned with avoiding pain than we are with the reality of death and what death really means. And so we need role models to guide us, and the spiritual teachers and leaders and gurus of all faiths are good people to go to approach and talk about things like this identity. Who am I? Am I a soul? Am I a consciousness? Am I a body? What's going to happen after death? And with that, I want to end with a little Woody Allen quote, one of the sages of our time. Woody Allen said, "It's not that I'm afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens."
Swamiji, in our Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma, it has been said that death has two components. One is the decay, cessation of the physical body. But there is another one called soul or Atman that is immortal. It never dies, and like fundamental energy particle, it transforms and reincarnates. And therefore in Hinduism, the life was supposed to be 100 years. It was divided into 4 parts. Student life, family life, then detachment, one class or sannyas. So once you go to sannyas, then you accept that body, this body has to go now. Accept it and be contented.
I think that's a beautiful summary of my whole talk. Yes, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And this is one thing that we're finding in this new science of consciousness. You know, in the old science, when your brain was dead, your consciousness was gone. That was the presumption. And what is death defined as in the medical world as brain death. The brain is gone, person's gone, you're dead. But now the new science says, that's not how it works at all. The new science says, actually, consciousness precedes the brain. The brain evolves in and of consciousness. Consciousness persists even when the brain is dead. And so even the new science of consciousness is giving us a reason not to fear death, right, Rudy? Yes. Om.
Swamiji, I have a question. So,
Please.
I have a question. You know, people in spirituality who follow the spiritual path and know about spirituality, even knowing that the death is just one way of coming and then going on to the next one, why is there a persistent fear or of the unknown? Why is that not getting solved with spirituality? Does it take a long time for a person to realize this truth?
Yes, I think yes. And as long as we're in our first births, we're going to naturally give expression to those lower instincts, to fear, jealousy, confusion, malice, hatred, all of that is down here. So naturally, when you die, you're going to be there. But for those of us who are on the spiritual path, we should ferret this all out. And like the Dalai Lama says, if you understand death, that's how you understand life and the continuation of life. You have to study it. That's one reason I brought it up tonight, is because we don't really reflect on it very much. I know that's a totally inadequate answer to your beautiful question, but I think it'll have to do. Om. Thank you, Deva, for reminding us of what we have to do. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Om Namah Shivaya.
Thank you, Paramacharya, for a wonderful dialogue. On behalf of the Kauai Hindu Monastery, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Before you leave, I hope you grab one of the gift bags. Paramacharya made a raisin ginger chutney, which is in each one of them. So thank you all for coming and have a wonderful evening.
Just one important point I would like to mention. Indian classical music is full of nuances and connections between one note to the other. There are predominantly two styles, one the North Indian classical and the other the South Indian classical. It's just like the same language but spoken with a different dialect. But why we always call this the lift to the ear music is because of the connections we have between one note to the other. So the same scale if I play in typical South Indian song, This composition is on Devi. This is a time of Navaratri. Generally we play compositions on Devi. I'll sing this for you. Devi Prova Samayamide